Present levels as a whole are the foundation of the IEP document. From these well-written statements, teams can easily move to goals and accommodations, and from there to services and supports for their student. Welcome to another episode of the Prepared School Psych podcast. I'm your host, Jenny Ponzuric. On today's episode, I wanted to chat with you about the impact of disability statement. You know which one I'm talking about. Well, everyone's IEP documents look slightly different. This statement is intended to tell the reader of the document how the student's disability impacts their involvement and progress in the general education curriculum and or participation in age-appropriate activities for my preschool friends. Why am I sharing tips about this statement with all of you today? Well, often it is the school psychologist who is writing this sentence or two. And for many of us, we have not yet received extensive training on how to write the sentence. Why else am I sharing some tips with you? Because for many, many years, I wrote what the student's disability was for this statement and not how the disability impacted the student. So if you are like me, you might need a few tips. Here we go. Tip number 1, have a clear understanding of how the difficulty can impact a student educationally. Ask follow-up questions to teachers and parents and students to see what this is actually looking like for the student. Anxiety looks and shows up differently for every student. Ask how the anxiety is impacting the student. Memory is such a big term that covers so many aspects of learning. If you have a student with a memory concern, exactly what types of things are difficult for the student to remember, and how does this show up for the student daily in their educational setting? Tip number 2, be cautious about terms such as may cause or can cause. That terminology is great when you are introducing certain terms in a report. For example, when I discuss fluid reasoning in a report for the first time, I share how fluid reasoning may help or hinder a student in the classroom setting. However, when we're at the point of discussing the impact of disability for this particular student, having a statement that clearly indicates how this impacts the student will be needed. Part of the assessment process is determining if fluid reasoning difficulties are impacting the student, and if so, how. Make sure you are answering the question, how. Tip number 3, watch your jargon. All of us spent years in grad school learning a wonderful new vocabulary as it relates to our position within the school system. However, part of our responsibility is to translate this jargon into parent-friendly language. Be careful of using terms like fluid reasoning or pseudo-word decoding without explaining these terms to the reader. Or, in the impact of disability statement, drop the jargon altogether and just tell the reader what you learned about the student's disability and how it impacts them in super friendly terminology. Well-written impact of disability statements can help the whole IEP process. Present levels as a whole are the foundation of the IEP document. From these well-written statements, teams can easily move to goals and accommodations, and from there to services and supports for their student. If you are looking for some example impact of disability statements, check out the show notes. I have provided you some examples in a handy-dandy handout that I hope you find useful. All right, everyone, I hope you found today's episode helpful. If there are topics of interest to you for a future podcast episode, let me know over at jennyponzuric.com/podcast. I would love to hear from you. Until next time. That concludes another episode of the Prepared School Psych podcast. And I hope today's discussion equipped you not just with knowledge, but also the confidence to take action. Remember, every conversation we have and every resource we share builds a bridge towards a more inclusive and empowering learning landscape for our students. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more insightful conversations and resources to support your journey. Share this podcast with colleagues. We would love it if you would also rate and review the podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Just a reminder, everyone, the information and advice provided in this podcast are for guidance purposes only, and all listeners are required to follow both federal and state law and their own school district guidelines and policies. Thank you.